Lionel, you were in New York when the smoke from the Canadian wildfires made it over there, but you didn't close the windows. Why was that?
Well, first off, the air from outside was the same as the air inside. I mean, we had to breathe something. That's the way it works. So I didn't think keeping the windows closed made much difference. More controversially, I did go out and play 3 hours of tennis each day that the doomsters were telling us to hide in our beds. And I lived to tell the tale. So, I don't have asthma or anything, so it didn't seem that risky.
And the point you make in your column, ultimately, when it comes to these fires, is that there is a tendency to blame lots of these events on climate change. Why is that?
Well, I've just noticed that in the last few years, especially whenever there is a weather event of any sort, it gets blamed, I would have to say quite lazily, on climate change. And in the olden days, meaning perhaps about 5 years ago, you would at least have had to haul someone onto the news to verify that who seemed to know what he or she was talking about, but not anymore. Now we can just call anything that is disagreeable in the atmosphere or the geosphere climate change. And I think that ultimately this backfires because it starts to sound like propaganda. That's because it is, if it's not backed by any causal science. And it starts to sound like background noise. I realize that this is politically motivated and that we're supposed to be convinced that not only is climate change somewhere off in the future, but it's happening right now. But because the attribution is so careless, it doesn't actually help the cause. And in the case of the wildfires, it's just inaccurate. They were started by lightning strikes. The wind then blew very hard in an unfortunate direction, and therefore a lot of little fires that were started that would have otherwise gone out got fanned. And then there was this weird high pressure, low pressure, high pressure thing over North America, which is apparently a rather unusual construction. Didn't have anything to do with climate change. It's called an omega block. And that explained why all that smoke ended up coming to the eastern seaboard. But, all over New York media, newscasters and columnists, and even the mayor of New York just said, this is all because of climate change. And, if you don't mind my saying so, they're talking out of their arse.
Cliff, do you agree with that?
Well, most of the things I agree with, although one thing I would disagree with was about the air quality. It was very bad at points. I mean, extremely serious air quality. And playing tennis outside in that air was probably not a good idea.
Okay, I admit, it was a little stupid.
That wasn't a good idea. And the other thing is, and the air inside the building could, if it had a circulation system going on, like air conditioning or whatever, it would have filtration that would have made the air a lot better inside. So just as some advice,
we don't have air conditioning.
There's no circulation at all. There's no. If you have a heating system, you put it on. You shut the heat down, but let it recirculate air. That can make the air much better. So anyway, so that's just a general comment. But I mean, the other issues that Lionel pointed out, I wouldn't disagree with. I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of hype of climate change implication for almost every extreme weather event. And most of it is not scientifically based. It's hype and exaggeration. And I'm saying this is someone who works on this in an intimate way.
And Lionel, just on the heating, housekeeping there, for viewers, regular viewers of Spectator TV, they'll know that you're not one to regularly use your heating system, yes?
No, we're not running our heating system, and certainly not when it's 72 degrees Fahrenheit, which to me is after the winter without heating is toasty.
But the secret is to turn the heat off and let the fan go. And that can really improve your air. So that's something you might think about.
Thanks for the tip.
Yeah.
Now, to go back to the column, Lionel, you make another point, which is actually government regulation could have been a factor in this. Can you explain why that is in terms of controlled fires?
Well, this is from a report in the New York Times, which is very rah-rah on climate change. So this is admission against interest. But one of the problems going on in Canada is in order to do a controlled burn, you have to get through this thicket of regulations. And it's so difficult and it's so time-consuming that the narrow window of ideal conditions, it needs to be relatively still and not too hot, that window closes by the time you get through all the paperwork. So they're doing a lot fewer controlled burns than they used to, and they're underfunding the Forest Service, and they're just not doing a very good job of managing their forests. And it's very similar to the problem in California, which is doing exactly the same thing. And that's, of course, the land of regulation.
Now, Cliff, do you think there is a tendency with some of these events that come up to almost talk about it in terms of climate change, which clearly can be a factor, when some of the time at least, some of this can be government handling, government preparedness, government regulations, and it almost can distract from that type of accountability?
Well, it depends what you're talking about. In terms of the forest issues, the wildfires, this is one in which government mismanagement on both sides of the border have profoundly undermined the situation. So it's just not Canada, the United States. I'm very aware of what's happening in California, Pacific Northwest, and the forests are radically different than they were 150 years ago, and a lot of that is due to suppression of fire, not allowing harvest of the trees. We have forests that used to be sparsely populated now are densely populated with this understory, and they burn catastrophically now. So from the forest side, mismanagement is right in the center of it all. That's going to be less of a case in other extreme weather events, like a heat wave or a cold wave. The government intervention is less profound.
And Cliff, on this, do you think in the scientific community there is a consensus there, or are views like this approaching controversial? In the forest community, and I know people, and I go to all the talks, there is a consensus that we have mismanaged the forests in the Western United States and other places. So I think the forestry community, there is a consensus. Of course, if you go out of that community into the climate change community or the climate activists, there's a consensus in the opposite direction. And Lionel, just finally, do you think that there should be more transparency or clarity from world leaders when it comes to talking about the causes of some of these incidents? In the sense, for example, I'm thinking of some of the comments recently from Justin Trudeau.
I would have more regard for the messaging if it were more nuanced, and it isn't. It isn't ever. And when you constantly attribute every single rained-off picnic to climate change, you make people dubious of your expertise. And that's my main message. This stuff is backfiring. And my other main message is that we're losing an appreciation for the difference between climate and weather. Now, it's true that climate in the great big picture is the sum total of all the weather. But we do have two different words for a reason. And the most interesting thing about writing this column for me was looking up a graph of the temperature of the Earth, which they have, geologists have put together over the last 500,000 years. And it was fascinating. And one of the things that's fascinating is, first off, the amplitude, that is a huge variation in the average temperature, and also the regularity with which every 100,000 years the temperature swoops down and goes down to about 5 degrees Celsius. And then it goes steeply up again. And we have been on one of those steep upward trajectories for the last 22,000 years. And almost all of that time was without any industrialization, no gas-powered power plants. And that gave me a sense of respect for the bigger system that we're constantly commenting on. And in truth, the periods of time that we're talking about are geologically almost non-existent. And while I try to keep an open mind on this whole issue, I find that the perspective I get from taking a step back and looking at the last 500,000 years, I find it refreshing, and it makes me keep an eye outside all the rhetoric.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, please do.
Sure. Lionel, I understand what you're saying, but what you're saying is not quite right. And you got to be very careful here. We have this variability due to ice ages over long periods of time. And that's true. There's all kinds of sources of variability. There's this ice age and out of the ice age. So the interglacials. There's El Nino, La Nina, and smaller periods of time. There's all kinds of cycles in the atmosphere. But that doesn't mean the global warming issue is not a real one. It is true that greenhouse gases will warm the planet and can warm it relatively quickly. So, we got to be careful. Just because there's been variations, that doesn't mean we don't have to worry about the issue. I think the key understanding here is that global warming is slowly warming the planet. We are slowly warming the planet. But that is not necessarily producing this whole collection of extremes that the media has fixated on. I like to use the term the golden rule of climate change, and that is the greater the extreme, the smaller percentage of it is from climate change. Natural variability can produce extremes. And so, we go in and out of ice ages, that's true, but that does not mean that human-caused global warming is not something that we should ignore or is absolutely unimportant. I think there's a middle ground here where the truth is.
I broadly agree that there is a middle ground, and if we heard more from the middle ground, the messaging would be more persuasive. I think we're being treated like idiots.
Thank you, Lionel. Thank you, Cliff.